Progress.
All right, everybody, welcome to week 1 of Introduction to Marxism with Chris Cutrone. It's really good to have you, Chris, and everybody else. I just have a couple of opening remarks. I first want to apologize, not for anything that I have done. I have gone above and beyond to deal with the problem of having to do everything manually. But with that said, some people have fallen through the cracks. Some people did not get welcome emails soon enough. There was also some confusion about the Discord link because it was added in a weird way to the syllabus document. And so I hope everybody's had the time to review the syllabus. I hope everybody's had the link to that. For anybody just joining, for anybody who didn't get it before, you should be good now. But I have received, I think, more emails concerned about this or that this time around than at any point in the history of Theory Underground in the last year and a half with all of the other courses. And so, yeah, I just want to say that that's all because this is, we're doing stuff with, we say bootstraps or shoelaces and duct tape right now. And that's because the system we were using was kind of breaking down. And so then I had to stop using it, and I've been doing everything manually, and my attention span and ability to keep up with emails is what it is. And so thank you for your patience, and everyone, it's just so great to have you all here. And any other questions about the good of the order or getting set up with the Discord forums or anything like that, let's bring that up at intermission time, halftime. We'll all take a minute to go grab refreshments or whatever at the first hour mark. But for now, let's put our hands together and welcome to the stage our professor, Chris Cutrone. Great to have you.
Hi, guys. So, thanks. Let me make a request. I'm not going to be able to monitor the chat. So, Dave, you might be able to monitor the chat, but what I'd rather you guys do is raise your hand. And then maybe, Dave, you could try to keep order in terms of hand raising. And let's handle it that way rather than the chat, because I'm not going to be able to do that.
Could we, and I just really want to emphasize for the people who don't understand, I did talk to Chris about this already. The first hour is lecture. The second hour is like, we'll do a Q and we'll do a proper Q&A. So write your things down. Don't raise your hand in the lecture portion, please, because we'll do it then after the halfway point. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Maybe it's a dumb question, but I'm more used to the Teams interface. Where do I click to raise my hand? Is it in the menu down there somewhere where I can click? I see a react button, but
if you click reactions,
okay.
Reaction, yeah,
there's
and then I get a. All right, cool. Yeah, thanks.
It's under reactions.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so all right, so welcome everyone to the first week of Introduction to Marxism. So I want to say something about just the readings that we're going to be doing. I want to do a kind of an overview, and then part of the first hour is going to be kind of framing devices for thinking about Marxism that will carry us through all 4 weeks. And then we'll turn to the Marx. But I want to set up a kind of a framework for thinking about Marxism as part of it. So Dave and I have conferred on this for a while, this course and the general framework for it, the arc of it. And so we've been very, I have been very judicious and economical with the readings, limited number of readings as much as possible. Today we have a lot of little fragments and scraps, but generally it's, each week as one text, except for the final week, which has basically 2 texts. It has Lukács and Adorno. And I'm coming at it from what might be a controversial perspective on Marxism, namely a perspective on Marxism that's influenced by Trotskyism and the Frankfurt School, both of which are extremely controversial in the realm of Marxism itself. Marxism itself was dominated by perspectives that were very hostile to Trotsky and also to the Frankfurt School. So I want to acknowledge that up front. And nonetheless, I'm hoping to make the case with Marx and Lenin before we get to Trotsky and the Frankfurt School of the continuity there. And in other words, to justify the perspectives that Trotsky and the Frankfurt School had on the basis of Marx and Lenin. And so it was kind of one author, one text approach, which obviously is very limited. And also, I will say, my own background is as a Frankfurt School critical theory scholar. And maybe my contribution to the scholarship on the Frankfurt School was to establish the Frankfurt School's Leninism, right, in a way that had not been acknowledged prior to that. And as a Frankfurt School scholar, the two people that I studied most thoroughly are Adorno and Walter Benjamin. And Benjamin has a concept that's very influential for Adorno of reading history against the grain, reading history against the grain of what happened. And that's going to be my approach to Marxism in general, including Marx and Lenin. So the unfulfilled aspects of Marxism, the insights and the concerns that tended to fall by the wayside historically, and that have been forgotten. So that's also what Trotsky and the Frankfurt School represent to me. They represent the memory of the things that got forgotten in Marxism, which are not the popular things. That's why they were forgotten. They're not the easy things. That's why they were forgotten. They're the controversial things, which is also why they were not merely forgotten, but suppressed. And suppressed not only by anti-Marxists, but by ostensible Marxists. And of course, the suppression by ostensible Marxists is more effective than the suppression by anti-Marxists, although they work together. All right, so usually, students, when they think of Marx and they think of Marxism, they think theory of class society, theory of class exploitation. And that certainly is part of the story. However, I'm going to make the argument that what made Marx Marx was his historical moment and his consciousness of his historical moment. Meaning Marx would not have been Marx if he had not come of age in his 20s, if he had not confronted the world as an adult when he did, and of course where he did. So he's a radical European intellectual in the 1840s. And it's in the aftermath of the French Revolution. That's the major event, still within living memory for Marx and his generation. But also what had happened was the Industrial Revolution. So the emergence of industrial capitalism and new phenomena that came with industrial capitalism that had not been seen previously. So one of the things we're going to talk about today is this category that Marx has of the proletariat and the role of the proletariat in history in the way that he understood it. So, there's the man, there's the moment, there's the intellectual influence, there's the political influence. So a very famous formulation on Marxism is that it's a synthesis of three things: British political economy, German idealist philosophy, and French socialism. What's usually neglected is that actually Marx is the critic. He's offering a critique of all three of those things. So he has a critique of political economy, of bourgeois political economy, of course, but British political economy, Adam Smith and David Ricardo. And he has a critique of German idealist philosophy, Hegel, which Marx considered to be the sort of high point of German idealism. But he also had a critique of French socialism. So we have a character in the readings for today, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who really for Marx represented French socialism. So that was French socialism, it's not just French socialism. Proudhon had influence outside of France within his own lifetime and already in the 1840s. So for instance, Richard Wagner, the musician, the composer, was a Proudhonian anarchist. He was a Proudhonian socialist in his politics. At the time that Marx is writing his famous work, The Communist Manifesto, with his buddy Engels, in the context of the 1848 revolution that we're going to be talking about today, Richard Wagner is a Proudhonian. And Proudhon is a specific kind of character, but for Marx represented a kind of historical culmination of the history of socialism up to that point. That Proudhon could stand in for socialism historically at that moment in the 1840s. Marx's first major critique of political economy is called The Poverty of Philosophy. And it's a critique of Proudhon's book, The Philosophy of Poverty. And before that, Marx had started, but didn't complete, a critique of Proudhon's What is Property. We have that in the form of the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, which again, most people don't recognize is a critique of Proudhon. They just see it as Marx musing on various subjects and pronouncing his philosophy, his economics, his politics. No, it was a critique of Proudhon. So the critique of socialism, the critique of communism. So the way that I like to put it is Marx did not invent communism or socialism. That existed before him. It existed as a mass movement before him. He considered Chartism in England, rightfully so, to be a socialist movement, even though it's remembered as a democratic movement. We're going to be talking about that today, what the relationship between the struggle for democracy and the struggle for socialism, how they're related, but also for Marx contradictory. So that movement existed. That was we might call a subjective phenomenon of history that existed for Marx. The objective phenomenon of history for Marx is the commercial crisis and global depression of the 1840s, which at the time was called the Hungry 40s. And we know it from such things as the California Gold Rush, the 49ers, and the Irish potato famine. But neither of those things were about potatoes or gold. They were about capitalism, and they were about the depression, and they were about the socioeconomic devastation and desperation of people. Because most people on the East Coast of the United States who went to California to find gold died on the way. So they had to be pretty desperate to do that. And again, the Irish potato famine was not just due to a disease and limited genetics of the potato crop in Ireland. No, not at all. And that was, by the way, Irish potato famine, that's the Irish diaspora. So the reason that there are more Irish outside of Ireland than in Ireland is because of the Hungry 40s. So that was the background at an objective level. There was an objective crisis of capitalism. And there was a subjective movement that was contemporaneous with the objective crisis. And that subjective movement was socialism or communism, which basically meant the same thing in Marx's time. It's only in the 20th century, it's only around the Russian Revolution that you have a distinction between communism and socialism, where the communists are pro-Russian Revolution and the socialists are anti-Russian Revolution. Prior to that, they mean the same thing. Actually, for Marx, the only different meaning that they had was, again, a historical difference. Namely, that communism had existed for a longer history than socialism. So socialism is a new ideology that comes with the French Revolution. But communism has a deeper history and is associated with religious community, like monastical community, that kind of collective poverty, but also had its moment in the revolutions that came before the French Revolution. So we know about the levelers and the diggers in the English Civil War. Those are seen as a variety of an earlier form of communism, and they did understand it in a mixture of secular and religious terms. So socialism, I'm going to use the term socialism rather than the term communism, just to be clear, because the Marxists will use the term proletarian socialism. They'll use communism and they'll use proletarian socialism. Proletarian socialism as opposed to petty bourgeois socialism or bourgeois socialism, also as opposed to Christian socialism or feudal socialism or reactionary socialism. So there are all sorts of varieties of socialism, and also, of course, most famously, utopian socialism. Utopian socialism. So all of that is in the background between the fall of the Jacobins and the period of the Directory in the French Revolution in the 1790s. Gracchus Babeuf, the Conspiracy of Equals, the left wing of Jacobinism after the fall of the Jacobins. Between that time and Marx's time, there had been a variety of socialist ideologies that Marx understands as subjective phenomena corresponding to the emergence of industrial capitalism, the emergence of the proletariat. So proletariat is an objective phenomenon. It's also a subjective phenomenon. So there's an objective phenomenon, a proletarianized working class, a working class that does not own the means of production, which was not the case before. Before, the workers own their tools. Industrial capitalism means the capitalist owns the machines, which means the workers don't own the means of production. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the workers own the means of production. That's why it's all about the Industrial Revolution, and that's why it's about proletarianized labor. They don't even own their skills, really, because their skills don't help them in the constant turnover of capitalism. So again, in an earlier pre-capitalist bourgeois era, the workers own the means of production. They own their labor power, they own their skills, and they own their tools. All of those things are separated from them in social production in the era of industrial capitalism. So that's what proletarian means. So that's an objective phenomenon, but then there's a self-consciousness of the proletariat, meaning it's not like this happens and people don't know it. They do know it. And Marx sees the evolution of socialism between the French Revolution and his time as the evolution of the proletariat seeing the cause of socialism as its own, rather than socialism being a more indeterminate bourgeois ideology of a kind of radical revolutionism coming out of the French Revolution, which is what it was before, kind of radical social reform. And also in the industrial era, as that registers with the utopian socialists, a radical vision of the emancipatory potential of technology. Right. The first working class response to technology is to smash the machines, the Luddites. And so we'll get to this a little bit next time with Lenin, but I want to say that for Marx, it's in the manifesto, for Marx and Engels, the modern proletarian socialist movement is about the merger of an ideological tendency that tends to be among bourgeois intellectuals with a mass movement of the working class that has been proletarianized by industrial capitalism. It's called the merger formula. The idea that it's this meeting point between a radical intelligentsia and the working class in its class struggle. And that's how Marx understood himself. That's how he understood his larger moment and the task at hand. Finally, I'll say something about where we are now, 2024 versus Marx's time. Marx thought He has a great phrase about this in the manifesto. Communism is the real movement of history. What that meant was he thought the Industrial Revolution was leading directly to communism in his own time. He thought the revolution on the horizon in 1848 was going to objectively as well as subjectively lead immediately beyond bourgeois society into communism, with some short transitional phase, but we'll get to that in the reading for today. It's one of the few things that he changed his mind about between the manifesto and the reading that we're doing, the 18th Brumaire. He didn't have the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat when he wrote the manifesto. He develops that based on what happens in the course of the 1848 revolution. So his vision is not that we're going to have nearly 200 years of capitalism the way we have had, right? So looking in the historical rear view, this is not what Marx and Engels anticipated at all, that capitalism would go on and on and on and on and on. So it's just something to keep in mind, that he thought, he and Engels writing the manifesto before the revolutions of 1848 broke out, but when it's clear that they're going to break out, he thought this is going to lead to communism. It didn't. And that caused the only major political revision to his view that he ever had in his lifetime. So 1848 is an important turning point. The period between 1848 and 1852, when he's writing the 18th Brumaire that we read for today. All right, so what I've given you guys in terms of like supplemental background reading, I was planning on potentially going through them kind of systematically, but it may not be necessary. But I wanted to at least look at one of the little charts that I provided. So you'll notice there's the Little Man and the Philosophy of Freedom by Horkheimer, which I think is a very nice summation of the Marxist view of capitalism that's going to become increasingly pertinent, but already with the reading for today, we will see the relevance, namely that for Marx, industrial capitalism and capital, to be a little bit more strangely metaphysical and philosophical about it, dominates all of society, including the capitalist class. So capitalism is a situation of unfreedom for everyone in society. Right, so it's not within, in Marx's view, it's not within the power of the bourgeoisie, those who are more advantaged, who benefit in capitalism. It's not in their power to transform it. Right, that's very important. So they're unfree, and some of them can see how they're unfree, and they can want to do something about it, but on their own they can't. So, radicalized intellectuals from the more privileged classes often see the problem of capitalism, but they can't do anything about it. They can try varieties of radicalism. They can embrace all sorts of crazy ideologies, right? They can become Nazis, they can become communists, they can become Islamists, they can become Catholic integralists, they can be all sorts of things. They can be Heideggerians. But it's not within their power to change it, for Marx. So the main takeaway from The Little Man and the Philosophy of Freedom is that, again, not a real original thought to Horkheimer, it's just a basic Marxist thought. Capitalism is not a top-down phenomenon, it's a bottom-up phenomenon. So capitalism is generated from below. It's generated and regenerated from below. And in a way that Marx was not clear on when he wrote the manifesto, but became clearer on in the aftermath of the 1848 revolution, actually, revolution keeps capitalism going. Right, so the people rising up, democratic revolution, plebeian revolution, keeps capitalism going. That's at a political level. At a political economic level, at a socioeconomic level, at a class level, for Marx, this is something from Das Kapital, but it's an insight that he had already in the Poverty of Philosophy, where we have a fragment from that included in the supplemental readings for today. Marx understood industrial capitalism as having come about, as having happened due to the class struggle of the working class. So the class struggle was an engine of capitalist development for Marx that nonetheless pointed beyond capitalism. So it generated capitalism, it regenerates capitalism, but it also points beyond capitalism. And the way it points beyond capitalism is through the self-contradiction of the worker's own struggle. So it's within the self-contradiction of the class struggle that capitalism points beyond itself. Right, so a kind of naive understanding of Marxism, that Marx is the class guy, the class struggle guy, and he's on the side of the working class, and that the essence of the struggle is the workers against the capitalists. No. So even before writing the manifesto, he was a jacked up Hegelian, totally. And he understood that the working class was struggling to abolish itself. And that doesn't mean just in relative position vis-a-vis the capitalist class. The struggle for the working class to abolish itself really only begins after the capitalists are overthrown. He wrote about that in the 1844 manuscripts, which were unknown during Marx's own lifetime, published in the 20th century in his initial critique of Proudhon. Right, so the critique of socialism, the critique of communism, is the critique of the workers' own ideology in their class struggle, a dialectical critique of it. In other words, a critique of the workers' own consciousness in their struggle for socialism in terms of its self-contradiction. And that's one of the charts that I've included, is the being and becoming and the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena. I'm going to really make reference to that more concretely in the 18th Brumaire, how these thought figures show up there, rather than talk about it abstractly. But again, an internal contradiction in capitalism, but really it's an internal contradiction in the workers' own struggle. And that means an internal contradiction at the highest level of their struggle, namely struggle for socialism. That was Marx's object from the early 1840s and throughout his life. Right, so the critique of political economy, bourgeois political economy, the critique of German idealist philosophy, the critique of French socialism or of socialism, is actually three ways in which Marx mounted a critique of the working class's own class consciousness. It was his critique of the workers' own consciousness, the consciousness of their own struggle, including the most advanced consciousness of that struggle, namely the struggle for socialism. So it's not just a critique of some bourgeois intellectuals' ideas in terms of the critique of socialism. It's a critique of the working class's consciousness of its class struggle for socialism. From the beginning and throughout his life, the only tweak he made to it was in terms of political strategy. And that's the lesson of 1848, which is really fully learned only after Louis Bonaparte's coup d'etat at the end of the Second Republic. So I will look at the one chart with you guys just to
Chris,
kind of
would
flesh
you
something.
would you
Yeah.
like me to put it up on the screen or give you screen sharing abilities or something like that?
Yes, please give me screen sharing abilities because I queued up everything
Okay, let's see.
on my computer, so I'm ready to share my screen when it comes to texts.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Okay, you've
Oop.
got it.
Now I got it. Okay, great. Excellent. All right, so this is one of the things that I shared that's on the Google Doc. And this is just to be clear about what Marx meant by capitalism, or what he called the capitalist mode of production, and also to introduce a variety of ways that this is discursively present in Marxism. So the way Marxists talk about these things are all related to this contradiction. So Marx defined the capitalist mode of production in terms of its self-contradiction, its internal contradiction. So capitalism is the contradiction of bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production. So it's between the social relations of production and the forces of production. But it's a self-contradiction, meaning these are not two different things. These are two sides of the same thing. And it goes to a more German idealist conception, which is, let's see if I can just bring up quickly. We could say it's a contradiction between what is and what ought to be the case. So it's a contradiction between the extant and its actuality, or between what exists and its potential and possibility for change. So bourgeois social relations is what exists, and the industrial forces of production, the reason that they're forces of production is that they're not anything but a potential. So the potential of the industrial forces of production, not the industrial production that we have right now. Because the industrial production that we have right now is formed and deformed, it's constrained and distorted by the bourgeois social relations of production. Now, what are the bourgeois social relations of production? Private property? Well, what is private property? Marx actually agrees with John Locke that the basis of property is labor. So private property is the workers' own property in their labor power, their legal right to dispose of their labor power as their property in an employment contract. It is labor power as a commodity. So that is the bourgeois social relation. It's not the stock portfolio of the capitalist investor. It is the labor power that belongs to the worker, the recognized social right of the worker to own themselves and own their own activity, and to dispose of it freely in society. So that's what's in contradiction. It's important to keep in mind because, again, the struggle for socialism, the class struggle of the workers, is to claim the right of their labor. Claiming the right of their labor means claiming their bourgeois right. It means claiming the right of their bourgeois social relations, from which they have become alienated in industrial capitalism by this contradiction of the industrial forces, the potential, the unrealized potential of science and technology, or what Marx calls the general social intellect, beyond a society of wage labor, beyond a society of bourgeois right, beyond a society of bourgeois social relations. Now, that's going to seem very strange to you guys. Nonetheless, it's very important. We will get to this next time with Lenin, where Lenin says, under the dictatorship of the proletariat, after the abolition of the capitalist class, and after the expropriation of the capitalist bourgeoisie, everything is still based on bourgeois right, and there's still a bourgeois state. The dictatorship of the proletariat is a bourgeois state. Why? Because it's based on the rights of labor. And that's why it's not socialism or communism. Because it's basically the highest stage of capitalism is the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's when the proletariat's in a position to confront the contradiction of capitalism in a practical way and thereby begin to be able to overcome it. Now, some other language that you guys have probably heard is ideological superstructure and socioeconomic base. Usually this is understood wrongly as the socioeconomic base determines the ideological superstructure. So the working class has a different ideology than the capitalist class because they rest on a different socioeconomic base. No, it's the contradiction between the ideological superstructure, which is bourgeois, and the socioeconomic base, which is industrial, and therefore has this potential beyond capitalism. Another one is consciousness and social being. So you might have heard that your consciousness is determined by your social being. Whether you're a worker or a capitalist determines your consciousness. No, it's the contradiction between the social being and the consciousness. The consciousness is bourgeois for everyone in society, and the social being is this constrained and unrealized potential of industrial production that contradicts that consciousness. And consciousness is not just what we think. It's not what's going on in our head. This is the German idealist philosophy. Consciousness is how we act. It's what we do. Consciousness is realized in practice. It's not merely theoretical. And it's the contradiction of consciousness and social being. So in everything that we do, we are contradicted by this unfulfilled social potential of industrial production, including what the workers do in their class struggle, including in the struggle for socialism itself, including if they were to ever take state power in the dictatorship of the proletariat. It would be affected by this dialectic of social being and consciousness, which means contradiction. Contradiction between the historical conditions and the practice and theory. Historical conditions are industrial. The practice and theory is bourgeois. And if Marxism is at all still valid or relevant, that means that today our practice and theory is still bourgeois. Even when it is whacked out Heideggerianism or whatever, even when it's the most anti-bourgeois, trying to liquidate 1789, the Nazis, some kind of Aryan tribal mysticism, doesn't matter. Islamism, it just doesn't matter. It's all bourgeois consciousness as far as Marxists are concerned. However distended and tormented, it's ultimately bourgeois in character. Even when it's Buddhism or some kind of, atavistic kind of cultural practice, it's been bourgeoisified. That's what Marx thought. And we will see what he has to say about that today, about Locke supplanting Habakkuk. Right, for instance, he's got a lot of zingers in the reading that we did for today. Okay, so let's talk about the Revolution of 1848, and let's talk about the he summarizes it pretty well, but you guys should know the 18th Brumaire, and this is of course in the apparatus of the text itself. It was written in installments. It's journalistic, and then collected as a book, so it wasn't written as a monograph, and it wasn't initially read, published and read as a monograph. And so it, is speaking to a reading public, an audience that knows what's going on because it's current events. And people throughout the world know what's going on. It's current events. They are, they're getting it quickly through the mail across the ocean, or really they're getting it by telegraph across the cables. All right, so there is already world communication, there's news, there's current events, and what's going on in France in the Revolution of 1848 is world news, and it's known, and people are watching it closely. Well, what did go on? So he makes mention of, this is very French history, but nonetheless, 1848, the revolution in 1848, did not only take place in France. It also broke out later in Germany in 1848-49, and Marx and Engels participated directly, personally, in the German Revolution of 1848. There was also an uprising in Vienna. So it's throughout Europe, in various places in Europe, but from Marx's perspective, and also more generally for people of the time, the revolutions of 1848 failed. So in terms of the French history, however, he's making reference to French revolutionary history going back to the Great Revolution, going back to the 1789 revolution. So he's got a lot of language of the revolution, capital R revolution, that's the Great French Revolution, the First Republic, which took place during the French Revolution. The original French Revolution did not aspire to a democratic republic, but aspired to a constitutional monarchy with adequate representation from the third estate, from the commoners, from the bourgeoisie. And I'll just say that the bourgeoisie were the town dwellers, that's the meaning of that word, and they include what split later into the capitalists and the workers. So it's the merchants, it's the artisans, it's the workers, it's the professionals, it's the proprietors. But there wasn't a proletariat yet, nor was there really a capitalist class yet at the time of the original French Revolution. It's a plebeian revolt. That's what it means to say that it's a bourgeois revolution. It's not a revolt of the richest people. No, they were on the side of the Ancien regime. It's a revolt of the people, of the bourgeoisie. It's a bourgeois revolution. And it aspires to responsible government with adequate representation of the people and an elimination of the legal privileges of the upper castes, the church and the aristocracy. So what they were looking for in the French Revolution was what England had as a function of the Glorious Revolution in 1688. The fact that it took place basically 100 years after the Glorious Revolution is not coincidental. It's not. It's part of the inspiration for 1789 is before the revolution, the Enlightenment. This tends to not be well known, but the French Enlightenment is Anglophile. Why are they Anglophile? Because they're looking at the scientific revolution. They're looking at English political thought and philosophy. They're looking at Locke. They're looking at Hume, David Hume. They're Anglophile, and they want what England has, namely what the end result of the English Revolution was. There was an English Revolution, by the way, which was a constitutional monarchy that established the supremacy of Parliament and the supremacy, therefore, of the commoners, the House of Commons, the bourgeoisie. They want that. They get something more radical than that because the king doesn't play along. So because the king doesn't go along with it, they get a republic. They get a democratic republic, which is not necessarily what they're aiming for, but they get that. And that's the First Republic. And the height and crisis in terms of the revolution of the First Republic is the so-called Jacobin terror. It's the Jacobin dictatorship. It's when the Committee for Public Safety is elected by the National Assembly and takes extraordinary measures to defend the revolution. The Jacobins fall, but they fall out among each other. That's how they fall. But the Republic remains, and that's called the Directory. And it's a period of disorder, political kind of dissolution and corruption. And that brings about what's known as the Consulate, with Napoleon Bonaparte as first consul. That's still the Republic. And then finally, in order to preserve the Republic and to save the revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte declares the empire. So it's important to keep in mind the empire is not the monarchy, and it's based on the Republic, as it was in ancient Rome, So the Roman Republic had overthrown the Roman monarchy, and the Roman Empire was not a reversion to the Roman monarchy, but was a state of emergency of the Roman Republic. So the empire comes out of the Republic. It's not a monarchy, it's a republic. There's a famous painting by David that illustrates, famous historical episode. I don't know if you guys know about this. So the Pope is going to put the crown on Napoleon's head as emperor. And Napoleon says, "Nah, I'll do that." He takes the crown out of the Pope's hand and puts it on his own head. That means it's not a monarchy, right? It's secular power, not divine right of kings anymore. It's not church anointed, right? Because the revolution was against the church. It was about putting the church in its place. The church had already been put in its place, actually, by Louis XIV. But anyway, it's about really putting them in their place. So he sees that history reproducing itself in the 1848 revolution. But before that, a couple of other events we want to discuss. The fall of Napoleon Bonaparte, twice in 1814, and then again in 1815. The end of the empire, and the restoration of the monarchy, the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy. So the Restoration monarchy in 1815, first in 1814, but then again more solidly in 1815. So that's the Restoration monarchy, as opposed to the Ancien regime, but it's the Bourbon monarchy. There's a revolution in 1830 that brings an end to the Restoration monarchy, and that is the July Revolution, illustrated famously by Eugene Delacroix's painting Liberty Leading the People, sometimes spotted at Trump rallies, with some metal type modifications, with some Americanization, we might say. And that revolution brings about, yet again, a constitutional monarchy, as opposed to a nominally absolutist monarchy. The Restoration was not really a restoration. You couldn't really restore the Ancien regime, but they pretended to. The July monarchy is formally constitutional monarchy, and they bring in the House of Orleans. Goes back to the Duke of Orleans, who was the brother of Louis XIV. So the descendant of the brother of Louis XIV, as opposed to the Bourbon, the main line of the royal houses, the Orleans branch of the royal house. Why did they bring them in as the new monarchy under the constitutional monarchy, under the July monarchy? Because at the time of Louis XVI's trial and execution by the Jacobins, the Orleans heir at the time was the one member of the royal family who signed off on it, who was like, yeah, he's a traitor. You can try him and put him to death. So that meant that the Orleans are kosher for the revolution. They're acceptable. They're fine, right? And so Louis Philippe Orleans is King Louis Philippe is the king of the July monarchy. He's known as the bourgeois king, the citizen king, and the regicide king. So it's when the king goes from being appointed by God to being the highest paid employee of the state, like with the British monarchy. Okay, so the 1830s, I want to just emphasize this point. The 1830s were a boom period. They're a period of prosperity. They're a period of even greater rapid industrialization in France and in Western Europe more generally. And that boom period is followed by the bust of the 1840s. So that 2 decades is really crucial. 1830s, 1840s. 1830s is the height of utopian socialism on the continent and in the US. In England, the 1830s are the period of Chartism. That's really motivated by this boom period. So it's a more optimistic period. And then the 1840s are the crash, and they're the more pessimistic period. So the way Marx understands that is that this proletarian socialism that supplants the earlier utopian socialism is more hard-bitten a little bit more Philistine, a little bit more narrow, and he critiques it as such. So it's driven less by aspiration than by necessity. But that affects it. It affects its perspective. So again, Proudhon's philosophy of misery or philosophy of poverty, right? That bourgeois political economy and its offshoots like utilitarianism are a philosophy of misery, misère. It's the rise of the social question in the 1840s, what's known as the social question. And it sets up the demands of the 1848 revolution, namely that they want something more than a constitutional monarchy. Why? They want a democratic republic, but really what they want is a social republic. So they would have gone for a social monarchy if they could. The big complaint in the 1840s was what was known as plutocracy, the rule of money. So basically the idea is that the July monarchy was corrupt and it was ruled by financial interests, by moneyed interests. And that therefore set up another bourgeois revolution. So I mentioned the Eugene Delacroix painting of 1830. In that painting, you have representatives of different elements of the bourgeoisie. More upper class, more lower class in terms of socioeconomic status, but a kind of united front of the people, liberty leading the people as bourgeois, as what we would now know of as class differentiated. So something like that happens again in the 1848 revolution in 1848. But this time, they're looking not merely for responsible government, constitutional monarchy, but one that will answer the social question. And the social question is the question of the proletariat. The social question is the question of this new kind of poverty that industrialization has brought about, and chronic and structural unemployment as the social question, as the issue. Now, I mention this because what was implemented when the revolution did break out in February of 1848, they promised to put all the unemployed people to work in public works projects. So they promised what was known as the National Workshop Program. So the idea is that if private capital couldn't afford to employ people, then the state would. So that was on the agenda. It was first and foremost on the agenda in the February Revolution. So the bourgeois revolution, the cross-class alliance of the people rising up against the plutocracy, against the moneyed interests. Their first item of business was, we're going to put all these unemployed people from the Depression to work by the state. National workshops. Then they quickly figure out that they can't afford to do that. So within a few months, they realize they try to do it through sovereign debt. So they float bonds on the international financial markets. And they also try to raise taxes. So they try to raise funds both internationally and domestically and fail to do so. So they have to cancel the national workshops. That's what leads to the uprising of the working class, primarily in Paris, but not exclusively in Paris, in June of 1848. So it's the breaking of the cross-class alliance of the people and the rising of the proletarianized working class per se. Not alone. They had sympathizers, of course. And it was brutally crushed, violently massacred in a way that shocked everyone. And yet was justified on the basis of preserving the revolution. So it was to preserve the republic. It was to preserve the common interest against the particular interest of the workers. So the workers had risen up, They needed to be put down because they were acting selfishly. They were acting against the common good. It's what you hear from the mainstream media when there's a strike, right? No matter how sympathetic we might be to the demands of the workers, they're acting selfishly by disrupting everybody else in society by going on strike. Which is true, which is of course true. That is true. But the question is how their particular interest might actually represent the common interest, but in a deeper way that isn't evident, that isn't fully manifest, that isn't clear, including to the workers themselves. All right, so they're brutally crushed, and they're crushed in the name of the Republic, in the name of the revolution, and they're crushed by a general, Cavaignac, who is the liberal candidate for president later in the year of 1848, in December of 1848. He is the liberal chosen candidate. He's the hero of the revolution, put down the workers, saved the revolution, restored order. But he is defeated by a very unlikely candidate. And that unlikely candidate is the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, Louis Bonaparte, who was a political radical. He was a utopian socialist who lived in exile, lived in the UK prior to the 1848 revolution. The radical political exile socialist, and who came in and promised to stand for the common interests of everyone, including the workers who had been suppressed, and including others who looked like they were getting the short end of the stick in the revolution and in the Republic, in the policies that were being implemented, namely the peasants. The peasants who were not a traditional peasantry doing subsistence agriculture, but really are agricultural workers and small proprietors in capitalism. And so who were looking for things like debt relief that the state was looking like it couldn't provide. So Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, using the memory of Napoleon Bonaparte, but Napoleon, by the way, was a Jacobin. He was a Jacobin. He was a general who had been a Jacobin. So he's a revolutionary general. He's a Jacobin. Louis Bonaparte is a radical of his own era. He's a socialist. Wins the election in a surprise upset in December of 1848, and presides over the Second Republic. He has a 4-year term. They have a very liberal constitution and relatively democratic constitution, universal suffrage, universal male suffrage, without regard to property. They seek to undermine him. The National Assembly seeks to undermine Louis Bonaparte throughout his presidency. One of the liberal measures they have in the new constitution is a one-term limit for the president. One-term limit for the president. So when Marx talks about this, he says, everyone's looking at the calendar. As soon as Louis Bonaparte is elected, he's basically a lame duck, what we would now call a lame duck president, because he can't run for re-election. And the period of the Second Republic, Marx writes about this in The Class Struggles in France, another major work of his, is about what happens in the Second Republic. In Marx's view, the political and social results of the defeat of the working class. So when the working class exits the stage or is ejected from the stage, is suppressed from the stage, so they kill several thousand and then they deport tens of thousands of workers out of Paris. They send them to Algeria and South America and other places. So the working class is smashed, their leaders are jailed, and then Marx is like, well, what happens then? When the working class is suppressed, how does that affect things? And Marx thinks that it affects the ability of the capitalist class to achieve a consensus. In other words, rather than the social question being a live, present, practical issue politically, it's rather the conflict of interest in the bourgeoisie, which is very confused. And so the liberals are interestingly divided. So there are some Republicans, people who want a republic, but then there are others who secretly want a restoration of a monarchy, who want a constitutional monarchy, who want to remove the executive from democratic control. And they're divided between Bourbonists or legitimists and Orleanists. So there are people who want to bring back the Bourbon, and there are people who want to bring back the Orleans. And basically it's tactical, it's which one can get a better consensus. There isn't much substance to it, but one common denominator that they have is that they want to undermine Louis Bonaparte, but they also want to reclaim the power of the presidency as such. Especially now that the people have shown that they can elect a president that is contrary to the interests of the bourgeoisie, which is how they see Louis Bonaparte. And so they try to set up both the elections in the National Assembly and the next presidential election by subtly working to undermine the universal franchise by limiting voting for the workers and the peasants. And they do that through residency requirements. In other words, they basically seek to exclude people who, by needs of work, are migratory. Right, which is a lot of the peasants. A lot of agricultural labor is migratory, but also a fair amount of proletarianized industrial labor is migratory as well. Meaning casualization of employment is not a new thing. It's not a new thing. It was actually quite normal for the 19th century. Stable employment is more of a 20th century thing and only really for a brief window of time and in certain countries. Right, what we now call precarity or casualized labor was actually more typical of labor in the industrial era throughout all of its history, the last 200 years. So something as simple as a residency requirement can exclude a huge portion of the laboring masses. And it sounds fair, it sounds reasonable, because after all, if you're moving from place to place, where is your voting constituency? Where should you vote? Right? If you live half the year in Alaska and half the year in Alabama, where should you vote? Oh, if you're not living in either place for more than 6 months, yeah, you can't vote because we can't determine where you should vote. So sorry. You know? So it's very subtle. In other words, they're not as brash to come out and say, we want to exclude the working class from voting. No, they can't do that. But in substance, that's what they do. So what that means is that Louis Bonaparte gets to pose as the defender of democracy and the defender of the revolution and the defender of republicanism, because it's kind of an open secret that factions in the National Assembly want to restore a constitutional monarchy, want to get rid of the democratic republic. Right, and so at the end of his term, when he's not eligible to run for re-election, he has a coup d'etat. So he disperses the National Assembly, he takes emergency measures to save the Republic, and he declares the Empire, the Second Empire, to save the Republic, to save democracy against the machinations of the ruling elite, who are trying to exclude the people from democracy. He has a plebiscite, he has a referendum asking the people, do you approve of my coup d'etat? Do you approve of the emergency measures and the declaration of the Second Empire? And they overwhelmingly do. So in the preface that we had at the very beginning of the text, I want to point this out. Two major celebrity public intellectual socialists write about the coup d'etat, write about Louis Bonaparte. Victor Hugo, who we know from Les Mis, he's a big poet, novelist. So Les Miserables is a novel, and then much later it's turned into a play, and then finally it's turned into a Broadway musical. Not accidentally in the Reagan era, Les Miserables. There's a reason why Les Mis comes back when it does. So Victor Hugo, who was a socialist, and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon also. So two of your famous socialists both write on the coup d'etat. But they write on the coup d'etat differently. One writes about the coup d'etat as like a moral outrage, as a political scandal. That's Victor Hugo. And really, caricatures Louis Bonaparte, kind of savages him and his character and his personality. And the other, Proudhon, who does a kind of pseudo-Hegelian justification for Louis Bonaparte and the events that took place from an anarchist perspective. So I'll just say something about Proudhon since I mentioned him earlier. Proudhon, interestingly, also embodies this unity of British political economy, German idealist philosophy, and French socialism. So Proudhon wrote famously that he only respects three authorities: Adam Smith, Hegel, and the Bible. Right. So Proudhon was the original synthesis of British political economy, German idealist philosophy, and French socialism. And Marx's critique of Proudhon is always about that. It's always about, yeah, you're not much of a political economist. You're not much of a German idealist philosopher. You're not much of a socialist. Right. But really, it's about the self-contradictory character of these things, because Proudhon was pretty sophisticated. If you read Proudhon, you'd have a hard time disputing Proudhon. He's a really profound thinker, and he's a wonderful writer. And he was more famous than Marx, much more famous and influential than Marx. Nobody knew about Marx. Everybody knew about Proudhon. So Marx is on the sideline saying, yeah, you're not much of a reader of Adam Smith or Hegel. You're not much of a socialist. But nobody cared. Nobody cared about Marx. They absolutely did not care at the time. Keep that in mind. So Victor Hugo and Proudhon are your famous socialists. Their books are read. Marx's not so much. Marx's not so much. Their books are read. And he sets up a dialectical contradiction and antinomy between their two works, which is the coup d'etat and Louis Bonaparte as a historical figure, an accident of history, a contingent accident of history, or the expression of historical necessity. And as usual, Marx answers that dialectically, namely both and neither. So he's both a contingent phenomenon of history and a necessary phenomenon of history, an expression of historical contingency and even accident, but also an expression of historical necessity. And neither, because actually looking at this figure and looking at these historical events will challenge your notion of what historical contingency is and also what historical necessity is. That looking at these events, looking at the course of the Revolution of 1848 and its results, will actually challenge how you understand these things. like human action in history and historical conditions determining the course of events. So he has a great line. Man makes history, but not under conditions of his own choosing. Another dialectical formulation, meaning that sounds very reasonable, but there's a contradiction there. There's a very painful, acute contradiction there. Man makes history, but not under conditions of his own choosing. Wait a second. Maybe that means he doesn't make history at all, since he can't choose his conditions. Right? But he does make history, nonetheless. What people do matters. Changes the course of things. Without necessarily escaping its historical conditions. Right? So there are a lot of like subtle phrases here in Marx that are famous, but whose meaning eludes us. Right? So what would it mean to treat Louis Bonaparte as a phenomenon of necessity, of historical necessity? What kind of necessity does he express? And this is really the point. I'm getting close to wrapping up. So he represents a curious kind of necessity. Namely, we think of necessity as like a determination, a determinism, meaning necessity means one outcome, one possible outcome, and contingency means multiple possible outcomes. It's actually not really Marx's idea. So the necessity, the historical necessity, is actually a contradiction. Meaning, Louis Bonaparte expresses a necessary contradiction, an unavoidable contradiction. So you guys will have heard from Marxists about the inevitability of socialism or the inevitability of communism. That doesn't mean it's inevitable that we will have this happy outcome of overcoming capitalism and inaugurating the realm of freedom. What it means is that we can't avoid this contradiction. That's what it means. The necessity of socialism or the necessity of communism means we can't escape the contradiction. So it's the necessity of the contradiction, not of any outcome from that contradiction. So that's where it brings in the contingent aspect. Namely, the contradiction is going to be expressed. It's only a question of how it is expressed. So I mentioned the dictatorship of the proletariat. One of the things I included in the supplemental readings was his letter to Wedemeyer, to Joseph Wedemeyer. And who is Joseph Wedemeyer? He's the editor of these articles. He's the publisher of the 18th Brumaire, both in article form and then in book form. So when he's writing to Joseph Wedemeyer and saying, you know, I didn't discover classes or class struggle. I didn't even discover, he doesn't say this, but it's true, the dictatorship of the proletariat as an idea. That's Auguste Blanqui, a major socialist of the time. Rather, he discovered the historical necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Right, so not classes, not the existence of classes, not class struggle, both of which had been discovered previously by bourgeois thinkers, by liberals, in fact. Liberals understand there are classes and there's class struggle. Actually, the liberals understood better often than the socialists did that there are classes and class distinctions and class struggle and necessary class antagonism. The liberals were often better on that than the socialists, who treated it as like, oh, this is just a moral outrage. And this is just some horrible accident that can be corrected. The liberals understood the necessity of class and class struggle in capitalism. The socialists came around to the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat. But Marx credited himself with understanding the historical necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Not just its possibility or its desirability, but its necessity. So what does that mean? It means that that necessity is going to be expressed, even if the workers don't take power. So the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat is going to be expressed. It's going to manifest itself, even if the workers do not successfully organize themselves socially and politically, take state power, establish their dictatorship. So how is it manifest? It's manifest in the capitalist state itself. In other words, the capitalist state expresses the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Marx's term for this is Bonapartism. And he makes a clear point that what he means by Bonapartism is Louis Bonaparte, not Napoleon Bonaparte, not Caesarism. So it's not, it formally, it takes the shape of the Caesarism of the ancient Roman Republic, the Caesarism of Napoleon Bonaparte, who after all wore the Caesar laurels, who understood himself as Caesar, as Julius Caesar, not Caesarism, but Bonapartism. And Bonapartism is new. Bonapartism is a phenomenon of capitalism. It's not a phenomenon of all history, of all republics, of all political crises throughout history. No, it's a phenomenon of capitalism in particular, and it is dialectically related to the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So it's the expression of the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat in the absence of the proletariat realizing that necessity. What does that mean? It means a capitalist state that has to overrule the bourgeoisie, that has to act in the interest of society as a whole, but is really acting in the interest of capital, which means acting against everyone in society. It means a certain kind of executive overruling of the democratic will of society, but in the name of preserving that democratic will of society. He thought that there were contemporary analogs to Louis Bonaparte, but that Louis Bonaparte was the clearest example of this because of how he emerged from the 1848 revolution. So he and Engels understood Bismarck and how Bismarck resolved the German Revolution of 1848 as a Bonapartist. He also understood the ruling Liberal Party in the UK as Bonapartist. In the UK, he called it parliamentary Bonapartism. So it meant this special role of executive authority in the capitalist state that has to take extraordinary measures that, strictly speaking, are not constitutional and yet somehow still represent the preservation of the republic and even the preservation of democracy itself. Even in non-formally democratic countries like Germany after the 1848 revolution. So they did not get any, they didn't even get a constitutional monarchy. But they got a modern state nonetheless. Bismarck has a famous expression. He said, "I've been accused of being a reactionary, of being a monarchist, of being a Democrat, of being a Republican, of being a socialist." And he said, "I am all of those things and none of those things. I simply reach for the garment of God as he passes by." Meaning, I simply do what's necessary. And if it's what's necessary is socialistic, I'm going to do that. If what's necessary is monarchistic, I'm going to do that. If what's necessary is democratic, I'm going to do the other thing. I'm just going to do what's necessary. I don't care what you ascribe ideologically to what I'm doing. I'm acting out of necessity. Marx agrees. He agrees. So the capitalist state has to overrule the bourgeoisie and its democratic republic in the interest of capitalism. So it's a modification of his notion of the state as the central committee of the bourgeoisie. That's the Communist Manifesto formulation, because that involves a kind of political consensus. Marx's point is that the bourgeoisie cannot achieve a political consensus, and so it needs someone else to do it for them. What he says about Louis Bonaparte and the peasants and the sack of potatoes, the homologous multitudes, actually applies to everyone in society, and that includes the so-called lumpen proletariat. Lumpen, which doesn't just mean impoverished and miserable, but means politically atomized. Right, so there's something in capitalism that atomizes society, all classes in society. He says they must be represented, they can't represent themselves, and they will be represented. That's true of everyone. And that's what the Bonapartist state is about. And you could say that it is what necessarily must happen in capitalism. And Marx understands the dictatorship of the proletariat as meeting that necessity in a different way, in such a way that would not keep capitalism going, but would allow for capitalism's overcoming. So that dialectic of freedom and necessity is very important. So Marx and Engels, they have a kind of a very arch formulation that's kind of Hegelian. What is freedom? Freedom is the realization of necessity. Freedom is the realization of necessity. Well, isn't everything the realization of necessity? Well, there are lower and higher realizations of necessity. Louis Bonaparte is like the low expression of necessity. The dictatorship of the proletariat would be the high realization of necessity. And that's the importance of this text. So we know Marx says, writer of Das Kapital, brilliant, strange Hegelian guy laughing to himself in his beard in the British Library, writing these crazy things, you know, about the commodity dancing, right? He's a political thinker. And it would be my assertion that you can't understand Das Kapital if you don't understand his political vision. Because in his political vision, you get a sense of what kind of a necessary actor the proletariat is in history. Not just a desirable actor, but a necessary actor. And without understanding that, you won't understand the point of Das Kapital, which was not to critique the consciousness of the capitalists, but to critique the consciousness of the workers. It's written for the working class, meaning they need to crack their head against this critique of their consciousness. Right? The capitalist class doesn't believe in bourgeois political economy. They don't believe in the labor theory of value. None of that. Who does? The workers. Only the workers believe in the labor theory of value. And that's why it's their consciousness that has to be critiqued by Marx. Why? Because they have to do something, realize the dictatorship of the proletariat. Why does Marx think so? Because of the necessities revealed by the 1848 revolution. And that's what this book that we read for today is about. Looked at politically. Right. So it's not like a Marxist analyzing capitalist politics. It's much more thoroughgoing than that. It's deeper than that. It's not just occasional writings written because he needed to earn money. No, Wedemeyer was a socialist too. And Marx was publishing in the United States as well as elsewhere. And the newspaper in the United States he published in was the newspaper of the Republican Party. That begins in this era. And the Republican Party was the party of the abolitionists and also of the German emigres after the 1848 revolution, the Red 48ers. There was a close connection between socialists in the United States and the Republican Party before the Civil War, both in the form of abolitionism, which had a lot of utopian socialist participation, and in terms of the German emigre milieu, the 1848ers who had to leave Germany because the revolution failed. That's the audience for Marx's book. Okay, that's what I've got, guys. So shall we take a short break? And then we come back.
Yeah,
sorry, I went a little bit over.
I'll pause the recording and
Actually,
we'll
a
be
lot
right.
over. I'm sorry. Okay, but let's just take a very quick break. Just stretch our legs like 3 or 4 minutes.
I'll pause the recording and we'll be right back.
Cool.
Recording stopped.
So I'll just kind of say this for the record, for the recording on the OBS side. So this will be something available to the people watching later. But if you're watching this, you should have access to the Theory Underground Discord server. The server has different channels and forums. Different levels of access at Theory Underground open up different areas of that server. Discord is not our sort of utopian platform. It's a good enough for now platform that we are using. So I guess I just want to say that if you're confused by Discord, don't worry. We all are. It's not it's Zoomerware. You know, it's not Xer social media. It's not millennial social media. It's definitely not boomer social media. But the functionality of it, there's a couple of things that make it more useful than a Facebook group or more useful than other platforms. And that is specifically the only real reason we use it. It's not for the little dancing cartoons that breakdance when you come into the foyer and they click the wave at you button and then there's like these little cartoons dancing. It's not for that reason at all. For now, the reason it's a good enough platform is because there are forums and we can use voice messaging in those forums. You cannot do that outside of Facebook messaging and DMs. You can't do that in the Facebook groups. And so, yeah, some people wondering why we weren't doing that in Facebook groups. It's beneficial for an instructor if they don't want to have to type out an essay response to you, and it's easy for them to click record and just speak. It's beneficial for them to be able to do so. And doing so recently for one of my own students at the State University where I'm an adjunct, I gave him a 8-minute voice message response on crude materialism, crude idealism, Marx, Weber, like this whole thing. And it was like a personalized podcast that I could have never sat down and typed up while I was on the go, but I was able to kind of do it while going between things. And that's a functionality that we don't find anywhere else. And so that's why TU, for the time being, is on Discord. So I just kind of wanted to state that for the record. Chris is not currently on there. He can if he ever wants to be. But the main thing is if you all, let's just say that you have a resource you'd like to share. You can share that in the Intro to Marxism forum. If you have a question to share, that's a great place to put it. And sometimes in a course, there'll become a theme that comes out of the forums where we've got different people asking different questions back and forth over time. And it can grow into people's papers. It can grow into a theme the professor will incorporate into the lectures. There's a variety of cool things that can come from a forum. And one of the best ones is that it has this sort of staying power. It remains useful after the fact. It's a way of staying in the conversation after the fact. And so all of you tier 2 and higher attendees here signed up for longer term permanent access to the forum for as long as we're on there. You've got that access, which means that you could be working on something a year from now where you're going back over some of this content and you bring up something that you've been thinking about. And that the fact that it's not presentist, that it's not just about right now, the fact that you can cook on something for a whole year, that's what we really want to emphasize. And so even though Discord feels like such a Zoomer platform and it's all go, 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 and if you go on other people's servers, it's all what's presently displayed that you're supposed to be keeping up with, this sort of infinite scroll. That's not it for us. For us, all we care about is that forum capacity and the fact that professors can, if they ever desire to, respond via voice. It's just proven beneficial in the long term. So
let me say something about that, Dave.
Sure.
So I agree with what you're saying. So when I teach an academic course, however, and the students are like, let's set up a Discord, I say, hell no. And the reason for that is it's very different from what you're saying. Meaning, I prefer things come up in class.
Mm,
Right. And so it's because I feel like they want a Discord in order to have an alternative to bring things up in class. And that's where I don't like it. But what you're talking about is something that transcends the class. And
right.
so that's very different. That's actually quite different. But let's try to keep that in mind. In other words, you guys can certainly and should confer outside of class, but try to bring it back to class.
Yeah.
Try to bring it back into the discussion. So I'm just aware of can we resume? Is everybody back?
Yeah, and so
Let's resume.
we're already recording on the main recording, but I'll go ahead and click record on our backup recording, which is the Zoom one. So
Recording in progress.
let's go.
Cool. All right, so I see Dave has his hand up, so that's a eager beaver volunteer to kick us off on the discussion. Dave?
Thanks, Chris. That was wonderful. So I've just been reading Rousseau with Doug Lane, and I just had a quick question that sort of relates to sort of the Rousseauian Hegelian idea of freedom. So when Horkheimer says at the end of his essay, the little man's interest lies in the Marxist philosophy of freedom, he means the sort of contradictory, the potentiality of the worker's own self-contradiction. So Horkheimer's talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat. He's not talking about like a Rousseauian kind of autonomy thing. He's talking about that.
Well, it's the same thing, but under different conditions. If there's a theme that's running through the 18th Brumaire by Marx, it would be that the general will has become divided, meaning the general will in capitalism is self-contradictory. So there's basically society and its politics and its economics are driving in two opposed directions, namely labor and capital. So society wants to preserve the bourgeois right of labor, but it also needs to preserve the value of capital. And those are in contradiction. Right? So that's the idea. So the idea is that all capitalist politics, all bourgeois politicians, including working class politicians, are trying to do the same thing: preserve the value of capital and also serve the rights of labor. And yet they can't do both, but they can try to do both. And that's what Bonapartism is about. That's why it's in everyone's interest and it's in no one's interest. There was one Bismarck phrase that I want to just include that I forgot, and now I feel really bad that I forgot it. So he said about the 1848 revolutions, about himself and Louis Bonaparte, he said that the lesson of the 1848 revolution is that the great political questions of the day will not be solved by popular assemblies and fine speeches, but by blood and iron. All right, that's the famous blood and iron speech. And my point would be Marx agrees. Right, but who's going to exercise that force? That's the dictatorship of the proletariat. That's the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat, meaning it's not going to be solved in terms of a bourgeois democratic revolution, no matter how bloody, actually, because that might be through blood, but what about the steel? What about the steel? Right, so the steel or iron, the blood and iron speech, what about the iron part? Right, the iron part is force, and force that's different from the people of Paris tearing down the Bastille brick by brick with their bare hands. Right? So that's the dictatorship of the proletariat part. Just wanted to get that in there. But so why, right? Is it in the particular interests of the workers? Yes and no. So when we get to Lukács later, Lukács will say the condition of the worker is that of society as a whole. Meaning the worker is basically the focal point of social contradiction that actually is affecting everyone. But for Marxists, the idea is that the workers are in the most unavoidable position of that contradiction. Like the other classes can kind of evade the contradiction more, but the working class is the locus of it.
Right. So when you're always saying you have to go in and through capitalism, that's kind of what you mean.
In and through the self-contradiction of capitalism.
Okay.
Right. So, and again, all of the extraordinary measures are done in the name of preserving bourgeois democracy, democratic republicanism, even the social republics. So what Louis Bonaparte did, Marx wrote about this later in the Civil War in France. In the Second Empire, he implemented a lot of the utopian socialist measures. Right, so he hired utopian socialists to rebuild Paris and institute a more equitable financial system, the Credit Mobilier, which ended up being a huge financial scandal by the end of the century, but it was a major international financial player. And so, it was based on a kind of Saint-Simonian financial scheme that was supposed to be better for the working class and more socially responsible in terms of government. So he did try to realize that in the Second Empire, and that's important to keep in mind as well, but he had to do so under a dictatorship, right? In other words, like, even though he had popular support, he had a second plebiscite that renewed the empire, and he got even more support the second time around, but of course it was more rigged by that time, right? Anyway, I think who went up next? Was it Carlos? Or was it Willem?
Carlos, then Willem, then me. Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, Chris, great to be in dialogue with you and everyone else here. So right at the beginning of the reading, there's a line that I found very, very striking where Marx is saying that precisely in times of revolutionary crisis, we look to the past. So I want to try to understand how did Marx understand the reason why we do that? It seems clearly like a contradiction there. In times when we're trying to bring something new, we necessarily look to the past. And I'm just wondering how he understood the reason why we do that.
All right, so there are a couple of aspects to this. One is he has to, in very Hegelian way, understand why the bourgeois revolution had to misrecognize itself in the way that it did. So the bourgeois revolution did not understand itself as historically specific. Or if it did understand itself as historically specific, that's more true of the American and French revolutions rather than the prior revolutions, the Dutch Revolt and the English Revolution, and the Italian city-states, and also the Hanseatic League, the Northern Renaissance. The way they understood their agenda was very much in classical antiquity terms of ancient democracy and Roman republicanism. So they understood themselves as realizing all of history and realizing human nature as such. Now, that's one problem, right? The problem of the misrecognition of the bourgeois revolution in humanistic terms, but also in Christian terms, like radical Christian terms, but also in terms of the Enlightenment available in classical antiquity of ancient Athens and ancient Rome. There's another kind of misrecognition that's afflicting the revolution of the 19th century. So he talks about the revolution of the 18th century and the revolution of the 19th century. And so the revolution of the 19th century is afflicted by the same problem of misrecognition, but with a difference. So here the difference is that the revolution of the 19th century will see itself not as the culmination of ancient struggles for justice and freedom, but rather see itself as the repetition of the bourgeois revolution. So where the French Revolution repeated the history of ancient Rome, the 1848 revolution is repeating the history of the French Revolution. So what's the difference? The difference is really this historical dividing line between 1789 and 1848, and that's the Industrial Revolution, which changes the character of history itself, changes the character of historical temporality, and changes the character of the repetition. So where the bourgeoisie could enlist all the ghosts of the past in service of its struggle, it's like Lord of the Rings. Aragon gets the army of the dead to come in, right, on his behalf. it's the opposite situation from Marx in the 1848 revolution. Which is that actually the past is weighing like a nightmare on the brains of the living. Right? So we're haunted by the past. We're not emboldened by it, and we're not able to enlist it, but we're dominated by it. So it's a different kind of misrecognition, and yet it is a misrecognition that is also a necessary and not accidental or simply mistaken misrecognition. Meaning we necessarily are repeating the bourgeois revolution in capitalism, but with a different necessity. Right? That's why the dictatorship of the proletariat is afflicted by a consciousness that it is fulfilling the bourgeois revolution, but also seeking something different and beyond the bourgeois revolution. So that contradiction between how capitalism calls for the restoration of bourgeois society while also showing a need to get beyond it. So that's the poetry of the past and the poetry of the future idea, because the poetry of the future idea is very tricky, because at the same time that Marx says the 19th century has to take its poetry, the revolution of the 19th century must take its poetry from the future, he's also against any blueprints for socialism or communism. So it's a super tricky thing. It has to do with the relationship between past and present, and also the relationship between present and future. Right? So it's, yes, we are repeating, but in a way that's different from the way the bourgeois revolution seemed to repeat history, seemed to bring history back around to its beginning. Right? Which had a kind of authentic moment, even if a misrecognition that could serve, as opposed to a misrecognition that hinders. Now, the dictatorship of the proletariat, by the way, is basically afflicted by the contradiction of whether it's democratic or undemocratic. But again, that's the same problem with the capitalist state. The capitalist state is democratic, but it's also undemocratic. But it is democratic. So very famously, Marx says that the working class needs to win the battle of democracy. Not the battle for democracy, is in the manifesto, but the battle of democracy. Meaning, okay, we got democracy, now what? And we already have social democracy. In other words, we have democracy because society itself, not just the state and its politics, but society itself is fundamentally democratic. Again, bourgeois right is in effect, and bourgeois society and capitalism are generated from below through the actual action of the working class. And yet, in self-contradiction. So again, it is democratic, but it's also undemocratic. But it is democratic. That's important to keep in mind. And because it's democratic, of course, it has to enlist its own historical origins, which is in the bourgeois revolution, in the original democratic revolution. But the idea here is that the democratic revolution is in contradiction, in dialectical contradiction with the struggle for socialism, the need for socialism, which will again seem to be both the fulfillment and the negation of democracy. Or as Engels put it later, he said, in the revolution, everyone will unite against the dictatorship of the proletariat in the name of democracy. Right? So again, understanding that as a dialectical contradiction. And therefore, political history, but also social history, right? We still have bourgeois freedom in capitalism, but it's contradicted by capitalism. It's not like we don't have bourgeois right and bourgeois freedom. We do, but it's contradicted by the necessity of capital. And politics is affected by that, including revolutionary politics, including the revolution itself, including the results of the revolution. Right? I mean, I always like to say, God gave me a gift. The DSA called its millennial journal Jacobin. They are Jacobins, not Marxists. They're Jacobins, not Marxists. They're very unclear about what is the relationship between Jacobinism and Marxism. Marxism isn't just the continuation and the fulfillment of Jacobinism. It's also the awareness that Jacobinism is self-contradictory, and the Jacobins, lo and behold, are capitalist statists. They're Bonapartists. That's what socialism means. Socialism means the state. So they're true to their name. Thank you, Jesus. Right? Because then I can make the point that has to be made, which is we got to be different from the Jacobins. Right? It's natural for us to think of ourselves as Jacobins, but actually the need is different and goes beyond it. So we're haunted by this history. The millennials had to resuscitate the Jacobins for their craven Democratic Party bullshit. But call it Jacobinism. That's all true. That's all right and true. Marxism is different. Willem?
Hey everyone. Hey Chris. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so thank you for being here. Been listening to you for about a year, and I think you really gave me some words about things that I was feeling about the left and worldview that I didn't really know how to articulate. So I want to thank you, and thank you, Theory Underground, for putting this together and for having such a great platform for discourse. So my question is, uh, kind of going back to a discussion you all have been having on the Theory Underground channel about like Gabriel Rockhill and this kind of pseudo radical conception of imperialism, as just kind of like, America as the hegemon that's imposing its will on the rest of the globe and whatnot, and that it's something different, and Marx and Lenin understood it as being different. Was imperialism just Bonapartism to them? Like, is that the same thing? Like, can in their conception of imperialism, could you just use it interchangeably with Bonapartism? Or
Yes.
what do you think about that? Yeah.
No, that's an important point. So my friend Spencer Leonard, so we've been motivated by the needs of educating our students in the millennial left, and now with Zoomers, to really dig deep and really get clear about our understanding of Marxism and its history. And so anyway, Spencer ended up doing a project. It's now a 2-book project, but it's going to be a 3-book project. So a book on imperialism and a book on Bonapartism in the writings of Marx and Engels, and really how they are the same thing. So same thing, but maybe different faces of the same thing. But what they meant by imperialism was the imperial state. In the United States, we have this idea of the imperial presidency. Right? When did the presidency become imperial? Which is a little different. It's related, but different from when the United States became an empire, when the United States became imperialist. When was that? Was it the Spanish-American War, the acquisition of Puerto Rico and the Philippines? What is it? Is it, so their problem, Rockhill and others, the kind of neo-Stalinist problem, and others like Trotskyists too, is that they conflate colonialism and imperialism. So colonialism is an expression of imperialism, but imperialism is not defined by colonialism. Right? So it's really about a phase of history. It is about Bonapartism and mature Bonapartism, meaning Bonapartism as it emerges in the 19th century and as it comes to full flowering in the late 19th century, which for the Marxists of the time, like Lenin, he called imperialism the highest stage of capitalism. That meant a crisis, a prelude to socialist revolution. So there it's a little different. We'll talk about this next time to some extent, where the existence of a mass working class movement for socialism in a much more organized way than had existed in 1848 was part of the dynamics of imperialism, both economically and politically. So finance capital, but also Bonapartist statism, and then its projection, the projection of both finance capital and of the imperial state, of the Bonapartist state, its projection abroad. Right, so a kind of late colonialism, a capitalist colonialism, or an imperialist colonialism as differentiated from bourgeois colonialism. So bourgeois colonialism is the expansion of bourgeois society globally through trade, basically, and setting up new communities of trade and commerce and production for trade and commerce, versus capitalist colonialism, which is more about resource extraction. It's also still bourgeois colonialism, but it has added layers that actually contradict bourgeois colonialism and turn it less of a expansion of trade and commerce and production of trade and commerce, and more domination by finance capital in the interest of metropolitan industry and seizure of natural resources, where it doesn't matter what the local people are doing so much as the resource extraction. Like I said, it's both. It still is a kind of bourgeois colonialism, and it's also this other thing. So they conflate those things, and they turn the contradiction from one of labor and capital into a contradiction of core and periphery, or of metropole and colony. And in so doing, they really fudge a lot of the issues, right? They fudge the source of the problem. In other words, the source of the problem is not the relation between core and periphery or metropole and colony. That's an expression of the problem, but it's not the source of the problem. Some say it isn't important. It is. So, but how is it important? And this is another way in which something that we'll get to when we get to Trotsky. Socialism threatened in Marx's own time to regress into a kind of bourgeois radicalism and avoid its true historical necessity in terms of the dictatorship of the proletariat overcoming capitalism. Marxism also experienced that in the 20th century, namely the way Trotskyists understand Stalinism is that it's a liquidation of proletarian socialism into petty bourgeois radicalism and democracy. And so you see that in like the Chinese Revolution, right? It's new democracy, it's the block of four classes, it's the national bourgeoisie versus the comprador bourgeoisie, right? Everything is understood in bourgeois democratic and petty bourgeois radical terms, and what gets lost is the task of proletarian socialism, right? So that would be a expression of this conflation and this elision that happens and lack of clarity. And also we'll see that Trotsky will call Stalinism a variety of Bonapartism, which just means it's the degeneration of the dictatorship of the proletariat away from its true historical task and into a form of state adaptation to continued capitalism, both globally and locally. Right, so the state takes over the necessity of capital accumulation locally, but exists within a global capitalist framework. So it's an adaptation to the failure to overcome capitalism. So, by the way, I should just say that in Marx's view already in the manifesto, even before the revolutions broke out and the results were seen, he understood the task to be world in character, not in local, national in character. So the fact that there isn't a revolution in England in 1848 is a problem for the revolution in France and Germany, from Marx's perspective. Later, in terms of American history, I'll just throw this in there because the imperial presidency is rightfully dated to Abraham Lincoln. It is. He does have to take extraordinary measures in the Civil War that contradict the Constitution. He does, in order to win that revolution. Now, Marx supported it. And the way Marx understood it was, well, maybe Abraham Lincoln is the American expression of the rise of the American working class. But what we know is that from subsequent history, did it lead to the dictatorship of the proletariat? That would have been the task of Reconstruction, by the way. Task of Reconstruction in the United States would have been the dictatorship of the proletariat. Failing that, it gave us the imperial presidency. It gave us political imperialism in the United States, which was first a Republican Party phenomenon until FDR. And then the Democrats took it over with Woodrow Wilson along the way. And Woodrow Wilson, I'll just mention this, Woodrow Wilson was an admirer of Bismarckian Germany. And he's the author of The New Freedom, in which he said, advanced industrial capitalism can no longer go with the US Constitution. You need a fourth branch of government. This is all very explicit. In order to run things, you need an administrative state, because the Constitution is an obstacle to the political and social and economic necessities of capitalism. And he was right about that. Right? In other words, after the Civil War, you get the industrialization of the United States. And with that comes proletarianization. And with that comes the need for the capitalist state to manage society in a way that it had not been the case prior to that. So Marxists used to understand the Civil War and Reconstruction as America's 1848. Dave?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So, I have, can you hear
You
me?
have something. Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Oh, yeah. So,
Hey, Dave.
yeah, so on anti-imperialism and colonialism and this whole kind of thread of what Marxism has become for people who are, for instance, Jacobin readers or Rock Hill enjoyers. I kind of wanted to ask a question
MAGA
about
communists too.
Yeah, I think I'll be having a conversation with Rock Hill and Haas this month. We'll see. And so, I'm hoping through this course to kind of really develop myself to be able to even have intelligible conversations with those guys, or people from those kind of tendencies, because just local activists in the DSA, if I meet them or if they're in my classes, for instance, they're very influenced by all of this stuff. And so, one of the things that I'm interested in that became very clear in reading this, the 18th Brumaire, was that Marx really doesn't like the lumpen proletariat, and I'm really interested. I'm really interested in where this shift happened, where all of a sudden it's like, oh, if you care about fighting capitalism, you have to be on the side of prostitutes and pimps. Because I want to read this quote for everybody, because I think everyone's gonna be like, oh my God, this is a fascist. No, I love this quote though. He says, "This society dates from the year 1849. On the pretext of founding a benevolent society, the lumpen proletariat of Paris had been organized into secret sections, each section led by Bonapartist agents, with a Bonapartist general at the head of the whole." And I'm going to read the whole thing here. This is, I don't know, just where is this in the reading?
Which chapter is it?
38, page 38 of the PDF from the
PDF,
Marxist.org. Yeah. So he says, alongside decayed ruse with dubious means of subsistence and of dubious origin, alongside ruined and adventurous offshoots of the bourgeoisie, were vagabonds, discharged soldiers, discharged jailbirds, escaped galley slaves, swindlers, mountebanks, lazzaroni, pickpockets, tricksters, gamblers, pimps, brothel keepers, porters, literati, organ grinders, rag pickers, knife grinders, tinkers, beggars. In short, the whole indefinite disintegrated mass thrown hither and thither, which the French call la bohème. From the kindred element, Bonaparte found the core of the society of December 10th, a benevolent society, insofar as, like Bonaparte, all its members felt the need of benefiting themselves at the expense of the laboring nation. This Bonaparte, who constitutes himself chief of the lumpen proletariat, who here alone rediscovers in mass form the interests which he personally pursues, who recognizes in this scum, awful refuse of all classes, the only class upon which he can base himself unconditionally, is the real Bonaparte. The Bonaparte sauce phrase. I'm sorry if I'm butchering all these pronunciations, but to me,
Oh, that's great.
just mind blown. I mean, you know, I've read the beginning and sections of the 18th Brumaire, but this was the first time I made it that far, and I was like, oh, that's not the quote you hear about at the DSA meetings. That's for sure.
But let's unpack that. So, because it's not just the lumpen proletariat, it's also the lumpen bourgeoisie. And yeah, the literati, la bohème, right? The Bohemians. And, you know, so I teach Walter Benjamin, and his Arcades project addresses this. And Charles Baudelaire wrote a, you know, famous poem, The Ragpicker's Wine, and even likened the role of the literary writer to that of the prostitute. Right? That you have to learn to, you know, please other people's feelings. Right? That's what the artist has to do. So it's, you know, so since the New Left, we basically have like, oh, Marx is so negative about the peasants and the lumpen proletariat, but maybe they're the new revolutionary class because the workers have been bought off or something like that. Right? But it's really missing the point. It's not about groups of people. It's about what they represent. Right? So it's not that Marx is like, I don't know, anti-prostitutes. No. It's that what do they represent as prostitutes? You know, so Les Miserables, you know, Victor Hugo, got the prostitute with the heart of gold, a venerable trope in bourgeois literature in the age of capitalism. The prostitute with the heart of gold. So on the one hand, she's a ruthless, selfish person. On the other hand, she has a softer side and gives up her life of sin in order to help someone, right? And sacrifices herself, usually nobly, right? Okay, so it's not like, you know, socialists are not for, you know, in Marx's time, including Marx and Engels themselves, they're not for like, you know, penalizing or suppressing the prostitutes. But what do they represent as prostitutes? And also, Marx talked about it in the 1844 manuscripts, actually. He said, the workers are prostitutes. Meaning he analogized the condition of the working class with respect to capitalist property. So he says, okay, the socialists, the communists call for abolishing property. That would just turn all of society into the proletariat. Then he says, well, the socialists and communists want to abolish the family because they want to abolish patriarchal male authority. But that would just turn all women into prostitutes. And he's like, you know, actually that makes sense because all women are already prostitutes. And for that matter, all the workers are prostitutes. Right? So we have to keep that in mind. It's not like some kind of animus that he has towards groups of people. But what he's saying is, what if prostitutes as prostitutes had their political interest expressed? It would be Louis Bonaparte. So Louis Bonaparte, he does have his own little milieu. He comes out of this milieu. He comes out of the milieu of Bohemia, of, you know, cast off, emigres, you know, déclassés, right? Fallen people from all classes. He's from that milieu and he recruits from that milieu. And a lot of radicals are from that milieu in that time. And what would it mean to represent that as such? But also, it's the difference between the proletariat as the representative of society and the lumpen as the representative of society. So it's kind of like two faces of capitalism. Right? There's alienated labor that strives to overcome that alienation. And then there's alienated labor that revels in that alienation. That's the prostitute as prostitute. And it's also the proletariat merely as proletariat. Right? Are you just working the system? Are you just doing the hustle? Then you're a prostitute. and Bonaparte might be your man. Right? So again, it's very tricky because like dripping with contempt, you lose the dialectical character of it. You lose the irony of it. You also lose the humor of it, actually. Because we should remember that prostitution was not illegal in France. So it's not prudishness. It's not Marx's prudishness. It's not. It's his rancor against society reveling in its depravity. Because capitalism is depraved. That doesn't mean you blame the victim. But it doesn't mean you ignore the depravity either.
Right. So I take the most important two words in that entire quote to be the disintegrated mass. Right?
Yes. Well, we said earlier, atomized,
Right.
disintegrated. So the antisocial character of capitalism, what would it mean to raise that as a principle? What would it mean to have a politics based on that? That's how he understands Bonapartism.
Well, and that's how I understand intersectionality, right? This is
No, I mean, it's the way we should understand capitalist politics today. It's very atomized, it's very antisocial, right? It preys on people's worst. It appeals to people at their worst.
I'm
Not
looking.
only, though. Not only, right? So that's the contradiction. So, because, like voting, politics is supposed to be ennobling. It's supposed to be transcending the self-interest. But what about the fact that in capitalism, it can't afford to be?
I want to tie that into the. You had said that the peasants and the lumpen proletariat and this lumpen bourgeoisie, like you're talking about, they're all part of that disintegrated mass. And I just wanted to say on page 61 of the Marxist.org PDF for the 18th Brumaire, at the bottom of the page, it's, I think, the only part that is, actually, wait. No, it's the following page where my point
62?
is. But yeah, the following page is where I was going to point out. Where he's talking about how the peasants, insofar as they share interests and and those interests put them at odds with the rest, and there's also a cultural difference, they form a class. But insofar as there's really no possibility of political organization there, they do not form a class. And so I think that that's a nuance here. Looking
That's
at
a tricky part, though.
Okay, yeah.
That's
Would
a
you like to
super
unpack
tricky
that a
part.
little bit?
Yeah, so because it's not so concrete as we might think. Meaning what he's saying is insofar as people share a condition, they are a class. But that's like a passive objective class as opposed to an active subjective class. And he is saying, okay, there's something about the peasants, they're dispersed. But as small property holders, especially as debt holders, there are agrarian wage laborers who are also quote unquote peasants and who are also represented by Bonaparte, and who are also disenfranchised by the Second Republic because of the residency requirements. But maybe they could be organized, but then they would be organized as workers and not as peasants. They'd be organized as part of the proletarian socialist movement and not as small proprietors, not as petty bourgeois. So there's, in the Class Struggles in France, which is a kind of companion volume to this book, he really gets into the question of petty bourgeois democracy and the petty bourgeois republic. He cursorily mentions that here, and how the petty bourgeois republic is actually the lumpen republic. Right? So what he's talking about is not groups of people, he's talking about a horizon of politics. So he's saying that petty bourgeois democracy doesn't rise to the historical necessity, which is why it will both support and it be overruled by, it will be exploited by Bonapartism, and why it has to be led by proletarian socialism. Right? So again, a phrase that's associated very negatively with Trotsky, but is not at all Trotskyist, is we could say that for Marx, the issue of 1848 is the problem of revolutionary leadership. Meaning, who's going to lead the revolution? And insofar as the working class, in its proletarian struggle for socialism, doesn't lead the revolution, then you're going to get this instead. In other words, people are going to be appealed to in their atomized self-interest as homologous multitudes, as united, but only negatively and not positively. United by common condition in capitalism, but not positively united in the struggle for socialism. All right, so again, it's not about, okay, who's the revolutionary subject? It's rather, how do we understand what the necessity of the revolutionary subject is? Right, so the working class, here's another Trotsky phrase. As long as the working class is not organized in a struggle for power and socialism, it remains merely the raw material of capitalism. Talk about harsh. Talk about sans phrase. Like, get rid of all the frilly stuff about bohemia and prostitutes, the raw material of capitalism. That's all that we are, unless we're struggling for socialism. We're the raw material. We're not even prostitutes. Prostitutes have a personality, a subjectivity. The raw material, we're just the meat in the grinder. That's what Marx is saying, in fact. We're objects and not subjects.
The other question I have, I'll come back in if we have time, but we should probably move on to everybody else first in the queue.
So there's the other Dave, there's Andrea, and then there is, I thought I saw one other hand. I don't know who was first. Maybe the other Dave?
Yeah, I'll be really fast because I know people are waiting. So Chris, would you date the sort of historical demarcation of capitalism to the 1830s, like the Lyon Weaver strike, or 1852?
No, it's traditionally it's understood as 1831, I think, right? So it's in the immediate aftermath of the July Revolution. And so Rosa Luxemburg put it that way, but also Marx and Engels at other times put it that way. But then Marx and Engels also were like, oh, maybe it's like 1825. But anyway, it's in that time, right? So it's in the time of the working class really registering the effects of industrialization and struggling against it. Now that's continental. Chartism, though, Chartism is where Marx sees it in England, and England's ahead of the curve. So the Industrial Revolution first manifests in England and then spreads to continental Europe, really as a result of the French Revolution, and takes some time to fully register there. In other words, it's in the Restoration Monarchy and in the July Monarchy, and it's not coincidental that the class struggle arises side by side with utopian socialism. So Marx can see the sort of Luddite, like working class revolt against technology, and the techno-utopian futurism of the utopian socialists as actually aspects of the same necessity emerging historically. So he sees modern proletarian socialism as the unity of that. So it's the utopian socialists realizing technology is not the answer, and the working class realizing that technology isn't the problem. Right. Andrea?
Hi, Chris.
Hi.
It's really great to see you. That was the best lecture on the French Revolution I've ever heard. Thank you so much. I guess maybe my question is about Hegel and Hegelian Marxism in general. Like how when you were talking, I just couldn't help but think of the phenomenology of spirit, and you know how Hegelian is Marx. I mean, you talked about this kind of dialectic of history between objectivity and subjectivity of the proletariat, and the proletariat needs to kind of at one point recognize itself in socialism, and yet that seems to have regressed. So if we don't have a proletarian movement, does that mean consciousness itself is not there? That if there's no freedom, what is there? Like inanimate non-being? I mean,
Right.
what is Marx?
We do wonder sometimes, don't we?
Yeah, like what Marx's? I'm in Platypus, and they hate the word metaphysics, but what is Marx's Hegelian metaphysics?
Metaphysics. All right, let me address this. So Marx, some of his earliest writings are about Hegelianism, and they're about the Hegelian aftermath. They're about the problems of the young Hegelians, many of whom called themselves socialists and communists, in fact. Did understand themselves as political radicals in this vein. So what Marx said, rather straightforwardly, not in a way that Hegel himself would disagree with, which is that the Hegelian dialectic is a labor metaphysics. It's the metaphysics of labor. So you mentioned the phenomenology of spirit. The phenomenology of spirit is really about the proto-history of bourgeois society. It's about the stages through which bourgeois society comes to self-consciousness. It's the stages through which labor comes to self-consciousness. So one of my pet peeves in the world is the lordship and bondage section of the phenomenology of spirit, right? It's about labor. It's about labor. It's about the labor of the slave. And once the slave recognizes his or her own labor, then he reveals or she reveals her consciousness to be essential and the master's consciousness to be inessential. That is the bourgeois revolution, by the way. The only successful slave revolt in history. The bourgeois revolution is the only successful slave revolt in history. It's the only slave revolt that ended in or resulted in the abolition of slavery, rather than just some slaves escaping so that they could have slaves of their own someplace else. Right. So phenomenology of spirit is about a kind of logical and to a certain extent historical exposition of the emergence of self-consciousness as the emergence of the self-consciousness of labor. And it is a labor metaphysics. It's also an emancipation. It's also a freedom. It's a metaphysics of freedom. The problem is that metaphysics of freedom is contradicted in capitalism. Meaning, I mentioned, I think Dave asked earlier about Rousseau and the general will. Well, you could say we have a social general will of labor that is contradicted by the objective tendency of capital. We now also have looked at another way. We have a social metaphysics of labor that is contradicted by a metaphysical crisis of capital, of capitalism. So that's why Marx can think that when talking about capitalism, it's appropriate to talk metaphysically, but in a way that we're tasked with overcoming. All right, so let me just, because I know a lot of you do have interest in philosophy, just make a very simple point, which is traditional metaphysics and modern metaphysics. So traditional metaphysics is overthrown by modern metaphysics, namely Kant. Namely, a new basis in metaphysics, a new recognition of the substance of metaphysics, where it isn't external, but it's internal. It's not external to the subject, but internal to the subject. Meaning, metaphysical categories refer to us in our practical action and as members of society. It doesn't refer to the properties of things in themselves or of the world in itself. So it's an expression of our relation to the world. And how do we relate to the world in bourgeois society? Through our labor. Right, so we didn't need Marx to come along and say, oh, this is a labor metaphysics. Actually, they knew it. Actually, Rousseau talked about this too. And Kant and Hegel certainly did. So the question is how that is both true and not true in capitalism. So modern metaphysics is not traditional metaphysics because it's understanding a different basis of metaphysics, what its referent is, what its reality is. But then it's also the case that even after we recognize that metaphysics is about our action and our emancipation and our freedom, actually capitalism's contradicting that. And we get a reversion to what appears to be an external metaphysics, namely the metaphysics of capital, or an alienated metaphysics of labor. We can say that capital is the alienated metaphysics of labor that dominate us, that no longer have a substance in our struggle for freedom, but have a reality of our being dominated and being in a state of unfreedom. So that gives a kind of a curious character to the whole thing, namely to get beyond bourgeois society and get beyond capitalism would be to overcome the metaphysics of labor, which up till now has been the way we've understood freedom. We've understood freedom as a metaphysics of labor. Social recognition through our labor, self-recognition through our labor, recognition of nature and our relation to nature through our labor. Capitalism points beyond that. We don't know what it will be beyond that. We just know it won't be this because this isn't working, right? So this is not a metaphysics of freedom anymore, so much as it's a metaphysics of unfreedom. And that's where people like Heidegger come in, by the way. So when we read Adorno later, and Lukács is paving the way for this, Heidegger is an authentic, to use his language, an authentic expression of the actual metaphysics of being in capitalism, which Heidegger misrecognizes as Western metaphysics going back to the ancient Greeks. Marxists say, no, what Heidegger is saying is true, but it's more historically specific than Heidegger recognizes. It's not an ancient problem of Western civilization. It's a very modern problem of capitalism. Now, again, Marx uses metaphysical language, very frankly, even though he knows, right? So why does he? Because it's appropriate. But he uses it to describe and characterize a state of unfreedom. Right. So, Marxists are anti-metaphysics? No, Marxists aren't anti-anything. Marxists have a dialectical approach to everything, including metaphysics, including philosophy itself. So it's not like an anti-philosophy or an anti-metaphysics. It's not empiricism. Like there was an anti-metaphysics, David Hume. It's not that. It's Kantian, it's Hegelian, meaning it recognizes the necessity of metaphysics, recognizes the true basis of metaphysics, but also understands that what was a description of a process of emancipation is now, at least equally, a description of the process of domination and unfreedom. Alienated labor. Alienated metaphysics. I hope that answers that.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. That was fantastic. Thanks.
Do we have time for one more?
One more.
All right, then it's kind of on this note of the bourgeois revolution was the one slave revolution that worked.
Succeeded.
Yeah.
Until capitalism made it fail. And that's why we have more slavery now than ever.
Right. And on the on the page opposite page 62, the only time in this, I don't know if this is Marx's doing or if this is the editor's, the only time that it's italicized and bolded is all revolutions perfected this machine instead of breaking it. You touched on that, but I just wanted you to maybe enclose, say something more about that. Has a revolution ever done anything for capital besides perfect
the state?
The state, yeah.
All right, so there's an ambiguity here that I think is very pertinent. So I'm glad that we're ending on this note. Right. So the way that I like to put it is there's two aspects of the state. There's the state in Hegelian terms, and there's the state in Marxist terms. So there's the state as the constitutional, legal, juridical, political order. That's the way we normally mean the state. We kind of have a republican notion of the state, namely the state is the public. The Marxist idea of the state is that actually there is that state, but it's contradicted by this other state, and that other state is the special bodies of armed men. So when he says the state sets itself up as rising above society and becoming something of its own, something in itself, well, that's a contradiction of what the state is. The state is supposed to be the legal, juridical, constitutional, political order of society, even if in a non-identical representational way. But it's not supposed to be like its own thing. And yet it becomes its own thing. And again, that's Bonapartism. So the state that has to be smashed for Marx is not the law, but the special bodies of armed men who enforce the law. And smashed, which is different from abolish. So Marx disagrees with the anarchists, who kind of put the cart before the horse, but also reverse cause and effect. So if you read like David Graeber, like Death the First 5,000 Years, right? Basically, in the anarchist view, capitalism is just a power strategy of the state. For Marxists, no. The state is the power strategy of capitalism. Meaning, in many respects, the state didn't exist before capitalism. So here you get this bizarre formulation of perfecting the state rather than abolishing it or smashing it. Perfecting the state machinery. What he means by that is it's a very complicated thing. Namely, it goes back to the history of bourgeois society. So the absolutist state, the absolute monarchy, is actually a bourgeois state. So it is a constitutional monarchy, even before it is recognized as such. So it is the alliance of the bourgeoisie with the king against the feudal aristocracy and the church. So the feudal aristocracy and the church, insofar as their power was paramount, was an obstacle. It was an impediment to the emergence of bourgeois society and the proper recognition of bourgeois society at the level of the constitutional, legal, juridical, political order. So it was the aristocracy and the church that had to be overthrown, and was overthrown in society, in social practice, before it was overthrown politically. And the first way it was overthrown politically was by absolutism. So Henry VIII broke England away from the church, but basically had like English Catholicism. That's what Episcopalianism is. So the Church of England is. It is Catholicism, but just no more Pope. And Louis XIV subordinated the church to the king. Right. And as well as subordinating the aristocracy to the king, making them all live at Versailles so that he could poison them if necessary at a banquet. Right. So that happened socially, and it happened in substance politically even before it was fully recognized politically. So in that way, perfecting the state is both in terms of the emergence of the actual state, that there is a state, actually, namely a constitutional, legal, juridical, political order at all, really a republic in that sense, as opposed to a might makes right, a rule of law, as opposed to a rule of people. But then there's also the apparatus. There's the apparatus. And that's where the French Revolution itself is this kind of hinge moment. It's the sort of last of the bourgeois revolutions, maybe with an echo in 1830. There's an echo in 1830 of the July Revolution. You could say that the 1789 revolution was completed in 1830. Namely, they got what they wanted in 1830. The same way that the English Civil War was completed in the Glorious Revolution in 1688, meaning it actually attained its object. And so that is simultaneously the legal constitutional order of politics and the apparatus for enforcing it. But again, that leaves aside the fact that the special bodies of armed men, the apparatus, might take on a life of its own and contravene and contradict the constitutional, legal, juridical, political order. I mentioned Woodrow Wilson saying, we have to violate the Constitution. How do we do that? We set up an unelected bureaucracy to actually govern. Modern capitalism can't do without that. And so the other branches of government will just have to adapt to the necessities embodied in the administrative state. Right? So there's a perfecting of the state in terms of attaining its ideal. It's a very Hegelian idea. And then there's the perfecting of the state in terms of utterly contradicting its ideal. That's what perfecting means. So again, he saw the task of the 1848 revolution to be that of transcending the bourgeois legal, juridical, constitutional, political order and smashing its apparatus. And then what? Well, replacing it with the armed workers, the dictatorship of the proletariat, which inherits the same necessity because capitalism is still happening. Namely, you still have the contradiction of the bourgeois social relations and the industrial forces of production, except now the workers are in charge politically. And that's why it will meet the same necessity as the capitalist state, but in a very different way. And will begin to wither away its own dictatorship, wither away its own repressive force apparatus. Right. And that raises the other really tricky question, which is that apparatus, namely the workers' own political organization as the agency of the dictatorship of the proletariat. But again, its role is to wither away as quickly as possible. And that will only be possible insofar as the contradiction between bourgeois social relations or bourgeois right and industrial forces of production is overcome. Or when people have to work out of social compulsion to people working out of desire, which Marx thought would only take a generation at most, by the way. He didn't think that would take centuries or something. He thought that was realizable within a foreseeable future, but with a political precondition. So that's one last thing that I'll say is that the dictatorship of the proletariat stands in inverse relation to the bourgeois revolution, because the bourgeois revolution, you had the social revolution before you have the political revolution. The political revolution comes at the end of hundreds of years of the overturning in practice of traditional civilization, subsistence, agriculture, unfree labor. And then finally, it achieves its political form at the end of that process. It's the reverse for Marx in the proletarian socialist revolution, which is that the political revolution comes first and the social transformation comes after. And that's controversial, by the way. It's extremely controversial. It's what everybody hates about Marxism. They all hate the dictatorship of the proletariat. They hate the idea that you can't just jump to communism now. They hate that. They hate necessity. So what they do is they rail against the Marxists, but meanwhile continue to live under capitalist Bonapartism. Right? And it doesn't help that the historical record of Marxism is like an extremely barbaric, repressive, totalitarian form of capitalist Bonapartism, Stalinism. Doesn't help that Marxism is associated with that, including by these motherfuckers like Rockhill, who's like, hell yes, that's Marxism. Well, that's a problem because nobody's going to endorse that. Nobody, except for some crazed bohemians. Crazed bohemians. Scum of the earth. Krapulinski. Some lumpen academics. Some
And some-
lumpen academics.
Literati prostitutes.
The
Yeah.
literati. Yeah, the prostituting literati. Right? Sorry, children.
All right, Chris, thank you so much.
All right, thanks, guys. See you next time.
All right, take care.
Recording stopped.